David Collins had lived most of his life far away from his roots. He left his small hometown as a teenager after a difficult time growing up with his family. His relationship with his grandfather, Thomas Collins, had been one of the few constants in his childhood, but even that bond had faded as he grew older. When David left the town, he never expected to return. But life had its own way of surprising him. One day, David received a letter that would change everything. It was from a lawyer, informing him that his grandfather had passed away. The letter explained that Thomas had left David the family farm, a large, aging property that had been in their family for generations. The farm, which once thrived under his grandfather's care, was now his responsibility. The inheritance was simple. Everything was left to David. No one else had been mentioned in the will, and no one had contested it. Thomas had made it clear that David was the rightful heir. David wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, he felt a deep sense of duty to honor his grandfather's wishes. But on the other hand, he didn't know the first thing about farming. He had spent the last decade working in a busy office job, living in a crowded city far from the rural life he'd once known. He was now a stranger to the life his grandfather had led. Still, David couldn't ignore the pull of his grandfather's land. He felt like he owed it to Thomas to at least visit the farm, to see what had become of it. The letter from the lawyer had urged him to come back soon, so David decided to take a break from his city life and return to the farm. The journey back was long and quiet. The countryside looked much different than he remembered, but something about the fields and forests felt comforting. When David finally arrived at the farm, he stood at the gate for a long time, just staring at the place. The land was overgrown, the farmhouse a little worn down, and the barn in desperate need of repairs. But it still held the charm of a place that had been loved for years. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the wind, telling him about the days when the farm was at its peak. David spent the first few days getting to know the farm again, walking through the fields, checking the fences, and inspecting the buildings. He tried to figure out what needed to be fixed first, but it felt overwhelming. He had no experience with farming, and he didn't have a clear plan of what to do next. But despite the uncertainty, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It was as if the farm was calling him, asking him to take care of it, just as his grandfather had. Everything changed on the fourth day of David's visit. He was walking through the old garden near the house when a woman approached him. She was in her 40s, with kind eyes and a serious expression. Her name was Sarah, and she told David that she had known his grandfather for many years. David, surprised to hear this, had never heard his grandfather mention Sarah before. She explained that she had been in a relationship with Thomas for a long time, even though no one in the family knew about it. Sarah claimed that Thomas had promised her the farm, that it was meant to be passed on to her after his death. David was taken aback. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. No one had ever mentioned anything about his grandfather having a partner or lover outside of his late wife. The idea seemed strange to him. Thomas had always been a private man, but David never imagined there had been anything hidden like this in his life. At first, David didn't know what to make of it. Was Sarah telling the truth? Had his grandfather really left the farm to her, or was she simply trying to take advantage of the situation? The thought of someone else claiming ownership of the farm made David uneasy. He decided to look into it, hoping to find some answers. But as he began to question Sarah, things got even stranger. Over the next few days, more women appeared, each claiming to have some sort of connection to Thomas and, in some cases, asserting their right to the farm as well. First came Rebecca, a woman in her 60s, who said she had been a close friend of Thomas for years, and that they had shared a deep bond. Rebecca claimed that Thomas had promised to leave her a share of the farm to continue his work there. Then there was Lily, a woman in her early 30s, who told David that she had a son with Thomas, a son that she claimed had a legal right to inherit the farm. Lily's story was especially confusing to David. He had never heard of Thomas having a child outside of his marriage, and the idea that there was a secret child involved made him question everything. David tried to stay calm, but the situation was beginning to get out of hand. Each woman had her own version of the truth. and all of them seemed convinced that they had a legitimate claim to the farm. David felt as though his world was turning upside down. He had inherited a piece of his family's history, but now it seemed as though that history was filled with secrets, lies, and confusion. How could this be? Was there something his grandfather had kept hidden from the family all these years? One day, as David sat in the farmhouse trying to make sense of everything, a woman named Carol knocked on the door. She was in her 50s and seemed the most determined of all the women who had come forward. Carol claimed she had been Thomas's wife many years ago before they had separated. She didn't believe in marriage anymore, but insisted that the farm was rightfully hers. Because she had spent years helping Thomas run it, her emotions were raw, and her voice trembled as she spoke. David tried to keep his cool, but the more he heard, the more it seemed that his grandfather had been involved with multiple women, all of whom had some kind of claim to the farm. Each new revelation only made David feel more lost. He felt betrayed, not just by his grandfather's actions, but by the entire situation. What was he supposed to do? Was the farm really his, or had Thomas left it to these women? The tension in the air was thick, and the farm, once a place of comfort and family history, had become a battleground. Legal threats were being made, and David was starting to question whether he even had the right to keep the farm at all. He had come back expecting to honor his grandfather's memory, but now he was caught in a web of mystery that was beginning to feel impossible to untangle. As the days passed, David realized that the farm represented something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just land and property. It was a symbol of a life filled with hidden truths, unresolved emotions, and relationships that no one had known about. With every new woman who appeared, David felt like he was losing a piece of the man he thought he had known. The situation seemed like it would never end. David was torn between his loyalty to his grandfather and his growing suspicion that there was more to the story than anyone had known. The story was far from over, and David still had to figure out what it all meant. Could he take control of the farm, or was he destined to lose it to the women who claimed it? What was his grandfather's true legacy, and how would David move forward with it? David couldn't believe how quickly everything was falling apart. His grandfather's passing had seemed like a simple enough event at first, but it had turned into a complicated mess that David didn't know how to fix. Each new woman that appeared, each new claim to the farm, only deepened the mystery. He felt trapped, confused, and alone, unsure of how to deal with the overwhelming situation. David spent hours in the farmhouse, staring at papers and old family records. He knew he had to figure this out, but the more he looked into it, the more complicated it became. He had trusted his grandfather, but now it seemed like Thomas had been hiding things from the family, secrets that were buried deep. It was as though the man David had known his whole life was someone completely different than the one who had lived on this farm to help make sense of everything. David decided to hire a lawyer. He needed someone who could dig through the legal details and find out if any of these women truly had a legitimate claim. After doing some research, David contacted Emma Turner, a local lawyer who specialized in estate law. She had a reputation for being sharp and thorough, and David hoped she could help him navigate the complicated situation. Emma arrived at the farm a few days later. She was in her early 40s, with a professional demeanor but a kind, understanding tone that made David feel like he wasn't completely alone in this. They sat down together at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers that David had gathered. Emma listened carefully as David explained everything that had happened. Since his grandfather's death, the sudden appearance of these women, their claims, and his growing confusion about what was true, Emma didn't hesitate. She went straight to work, reviewing the will, the family records, and anything else that might offer some answers. After a few days of research, she came to a shocking conclusion. The original will David had seen was not the only one. There was an older version, one that had been hidden away, and it contained key details that no one had known about. The older will was more complex than the one David had initially read. It not only named David as the primary heir, but also mentioned the women who had come forward, including Sarah, Rebecca, Lily, and Carol. The The will made it clear that Thomas had promised them all a share of the farm. But the promises weren't the same for everyone. Some women were to receive a portion of the land, while others were given specific roles in running the farm. The more Emma read, the more it seemed like Thomas had intended to keep these relationships a secret from the rest of the family, but he had planned to include them in the future of the farm. Emma explained to David that it was clear Thomas had tried to divide the farm's ownership in a way that reflected his complex relationships, but he hadn't been open about it. The will wasn't illegal, but it was unusual, and it didn't explain everything. David was stunned by the revelation. His grandfather had left more than just land. He had left behind a legacy of hidden lies and complicated emotions. The more David thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't simply ignore the women who had come forward. Each of them had a story, a history with Thomas that was tied to the farm. Sarah, Rebecca, Lily, and Carol weren't just strangers trying to take what didn't belong to them. They were people who had been part of Thomas's life in ways David hadn't understood. David decided to meet with each of the women, one by one, to hear their side of the story. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had to face the truth if he wanted to move forward. The first woman he met was Sarah, the one who had started it all. She was the one who had claimed Thomas had promised her the farm, and she was the most determined of all the women. When David sat down with Sarah, he could see the pain in her eyes. She spoke softly but with a sense of certainty, explaining how she had known Thomas for over a decade. Their relationship had been quiet, private, and meaningful to both of them. She had never wanted to be a part of the family drama, but she had always felt that she had a place on the farm. Sarah wasn't just looking for money or control. She wanted a part of Thomas's legacy, a way to honor the years they had spent together. David listened, and as she spoke, something clicked in his mind. He could feel the weight of Sarah's words, the genuine emotion behind them. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about love, loss, and the complicated nature of relationships. Sarah wasn't asking for the farm to be hers alone. She wanted to be a part of something his grandfather had built, something that had meant a lot to both of them. Next, David met with Rebecca, the older woman who had claimed to have been Thomas's close friend. Rebecca had known Thomas for many years, and although the relationship hadn't been romantic, she had played a significant role in the farm's history. She explained how, in his later years, Thomas had relied on her for help with the land. She had worked alongside him, shared meals with him, and helped keep the farm going when no one else could. Rebecca didn't want the farm for herself. She wanted to continue helping to run it, just as she had done when Thomas was alive. David was beginning to understand that each of these women had a connection to his grandfather. They weren't just claiming the farm for selfish reasons. They were claiming it because they felt a part of it. They had all helped shape the farm in different ways. And it wasn't just about ownership, it was about continuing Thomas's work. When David met with Lily, the woman who had claimed to have a child with Thomas, things became even more complicated. Lily was young and seemed both nervous and determined. She told David that Thomas had been a father to her son, and that her child was entitled to a part of the farm. The story sounded unbelievable at first, but as David listened, he realized that it might be true. Lily was not looking for money. She just wanted to provide for her son and honor the man who had been a father figure to him. Lily's claim made David question everything, but it also made him realize that Thomas had left behind not just a farm, but a family in a way he hadn't known. The final woman David met was Carol, who claimed she had been married to Thomas years ago. She seemed angry and hurt, and her emotions were raw. Carol's claim was different from the others. She believed she had a right to the farm because of the time she had spent with Thomas. She didn't have any romantic attachment to the land, but she felt that after all those years, she deserved something in return. The more David met with these women, the more he realized that Thomas had led a life full of deep, complicated relationships. It was no longer just about the farm. It was about understanding his grandfather as a person. David had come to the farm expecting to find a legacy of hard work, but instead, he found a legacy of love, complexity, and hidden lives. After all the meetings, David felt like he had no clear answers. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't make this decision alone. He had to honor his grandfather's wishes. But he also had to consider the women who had been a part of his life. The farm wasn't just a piece of property. It was a living testament to his grandfather's relationships and the history he had left behind. David knew that he couldn't simply sell the farm or walk away. The legacy of his grandfather's life needed to be honored, and the farm needed to remain a place of shared history. But how could he make peace with all these different claims? What was the right thing to do? In the end, David decided he would have to work with these women to find a solution. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges, but it was the only way to respect both his grandfather's wishes and the women's claims to the farm. The story wasn't over yet, but David was beginning to understand that the true inheritance wasn't just the land. It was about the people who had been part of it and the relationships that had shaped it.